Well, we've worked through a number of the criteria, and now we're going to switch to the defense budget. And Tori, you've been looking at that. What we specifically set in our criteria for that was, does it reflect the administration's Ukraine policy? You've got some background and some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context before I answer the question directly, just because I think there are some myths that surround defense spending. And if you're going to give me a microphone and a platform and some people to listen, I'm going to take the opportunity and talk a little bit. So,
Okay.
so,
You got it.
so here we go. Well, first, since time immemorial, Democrats have been champions of social spending. Republicans have been champions of defense spending. Democrats prioritize a strong, social safety net. Republicans prioritize a strong national defense. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just, things that demarcate the two parties. So when we have a divided government, as we do now, it's typical for the party in power, in this case, President Biden, a Democrat in the White House, to lowball the other side's, this means the Republican priorities in the budget, knowing that when it comes time to negotiate, the president's going to have to give ground and compromise. And they'd rather do that at the end of negotiations than before they've even begun. I mean, why should President Biden negotiate against himself? And if you recall, President Biden's very first defense proposal 2 years ago was flat. Zero increase. Okay. So that's why before I even broke open the books on this budget, I knew Biden's defense number was going to be low. And it is. At a time when the United States is arming Ukraine in its war against Russia. We've already appropriated $113 billion in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine and counting. We're not done yet. Tensions are building with China, and today's inflation data says that inflation is running at 6%. The Biden budget proposes an unrealistic 3.2% increase, most of it for the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and all in, that's about $886 billion for fiscal 24. And to put this in context, the defense budget increase last year, when the dust finally settled, was a 10% increase. Now, Democrats are going to squawk. They're going to say that the defense budget is bloated, that it dwarfs every other category of discretionary spending, and it needs to be cut. And they do have a point. The Pentagon is lousy at tracking its spending. There's certainly waste, fraud, and abuse that can be eliminated. But Democrats are also only telling half the story when they say things like that. Defense may be the single largest category of discretionary spending, but that's because nearly all defense spending is discretionary. We have a ton of non-defense social safety net spending on the mandatory side, namely Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and those dwarf the defense budget. When you look at total spending for last year, defense budget was about 13% of total spending, but Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid was 45% of total spending. So let's put this a little bit into context. And when you compare defense spending to the overall size of the economy, the defense budget's actually been shrinking since the 1980s. If you remember the Reagan era, defense was nearly 6% of GDP. Now it's around 3% of GDP. So let's talk some specifics about the Biden budget. On the good news, the Biden budget is rightfully heavy on munitions, basically the weapons that we need to fight. The budget also spends big on personnel. We're not growing our service ranks, but the Biden budget would provide a pretty hefty raise, a 5.2% raise for military personnel and the civilians who work for the Defense Department. And again, inflation running at 6% or higher, that makes sense. Moreover, the budget recognizes that we need to start doing business differently if our armed forces are going to be ready for direct conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine revealed a major vulnerability in U.S. arms manufacturing as our defense industrial base failed to keep pace, or I shouldn't say failed, they struggled to keep pace with demand. So for the first time, the Pentagon is asking Congress to improve multi-year money for the purchase of these weapons. We already do this for ships and aircraft, and now they want to do it for weapons. And there's a good reason to do that, because if the Pentagon can secure bulk discounts, then that approach might actually save money in the long run. Now, here's what really disappoints me about the Biden budget, however, and it comes squarely to the criteria that we've set forward, was the bold-faced admission that President Biden has no intention, zero intention of funding our support for Ukraine through the regular appropriations process. Okay. A spokesman for the administration said specifically that instead they will rely on supplemental requests on an as needed basis, which typically means, dear Lord, the Ukrainians are running out of weapons. We need to pass this bill fast, and we're going to designate this spending as an emergency, even though we knew last March that we'd need it eventually. Okay. That makes me mad. And why does this matter? It matters because it doesn't require the federal government to prioritize needs versus wants. If the current climes and times require a beefy military budget, okay, let's try and find some savings elsewhere in the Pentagon budget. And hey, members of Congress, I'm talking to you. You are the ones that pad the defense appropriations bill year after year with stuff the Pentagon doesn't want, didn't ask for, and didn't need because it's manufactured by some contractor in your state or district. And B, let's see if there's anything we can trim from the non-defense side. Okay, this concept of parity that developed, under the Budget Control Act in 2011, that we have to have equal increases in defense and non-defense spending, is childish at best, and it is wasteful at worst. One last thing I wanted to point out. The senior Republican on the Senate Budget Committee, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, he issued a press release pounding the 3.2% defense increase, as pounding it as paltry. I totally expected that. I went over to look and see what the House Republican Budget Committee chairman was saying. Jody Arrington, his press release about the Biden budget was filled with all kinds of criticism, but didn't say a peep, didn't say a thing about the defense budget and the paltry 3.2% increase in defense spending. So I sense some dissension within the ranks of Republicans on the defense budget, and it'll be interesting to see what the Republicans do with their budget whenever they decide to produce one.
So what's your color code?
Oh yeah, what's the red or cut? Well, the direct question was, do they provide for their Ukraine policy? And the answer is no. They specifically say no. We're going to rely on supplemental emergency requests. So I give them a big fat red light.